Hello, I'm Scott Bevan, and thank you for joining me for Voices of the Hunter. Now, as a city, Newcastle is the sum of many communities, as people have arrived here to start a new life. In the process, they've enriched the city's life, for they bring with them elements of their past, their culture, their memories, their stories. Now, one of those communities is made up of people from a village in Italy called Letezi. In the years after the Second World War, more than 100 made the move from this village to Newcastle. They are known as the Letezi, and they have gone on to contribute to Newcastle in so many ways, from law and construction to food and music. And one of the acclaimed musical sons of the Letezi is Vincenzo Martinelli. Vincenzo, or Vinny as he is known by many, took to the guitar as a kid, growing up in Hamilton. And since then, he's grown into an acclaimed guitarist who has strummed his way around the globe, touring and recording. These days, Vincenzo lives in the United States, but he's returned home to visit his family. So we caught up in Hamilton to talk about the past, both his and the Letezi's, and of course, to yarn about music. Well, I'm standing in Cleary Street, Hamilton, with Vincenzo Martinelli. But I can call you Vinny, because all your friends call you Vinny, and I consider myself a friend.
You sure can, Scott. You know, Vinny or Vince, whatever you're comfortable with. I answered all those things.
Vinny, you're not normally here. Where are you normally? Although we will explain later why we're standing in Hamilton. What's your life normally like, and where are you?
Well, for the past 20 years, I've been travelling the world performing largely on international luxury cruise ships. And that's taken up a lot of my travelling time and performance time as well. And on top of that, I've had the pleasure of being offered pretty amazing concerts in places like Amman, in Jordan, in Cairo, in Egypt, from people that have met me along the way. And I fondly remember a concert on the big island of Hawaii after meeting a guy and his Korean wife on a crystal cruise. So mainly travelling the world on cruise ships has been my life for the last 20 years.
Well, here you are. You've floated back to where it all began, to Hamilton. What's it like to be back here in not just your hometown, but your home suburb?
Well, it's a really, it's an amazing trip, nostalgic trip, Scott, you know, down memory lane here. I'm looking at my old family home. So many great memories here. I'm looking at the neighbours' houses, and I remember Mr. and Mrs. Dean, and I remember the Tagarillius family down the street, and the Sester family across the way, and the park nearby, Gregson Park, where we used to go and play footy and soccer, and had my buddies here, and I remember going to the neighbours' houses and being invited in for breakfast. But a lot of memories, and I guess this is where the music started as well. You know, my father used to play the mandolin, and I remember fondly those memories of playing music with him as I was growing up in this house. And his Italian buddies would come over and bring their instruments as well, and we'd make music in this house. I was, I think, as young as 6 or 7 years old when I first remember those memories.
Is this house the house you grew up in, or is it a different structure? In other words, are you looking at home, or are you looking at something entirely different there?
I am not looking at home anymore. This is completely new structure. It's a modern-looking place. Ours was a traditional bungalow with a little front yard, and we had a decent backyard as well. But it was a small house, and I lived there with my mother and father and my sister. And later on in life, we moved to a bigger house in Hamilton, but this is not the same house.
You mentioned your dad before, and your heritage is Italian, and you come from a group known as the Letezi.
Yes.
Who and what are the Letezi?
Well, Letezi are a people that represent a village in Italy known as Letopalena. It is in the region known as Abruzzo, and after the war, due to the destruction of that town, a huge migration of those folks came to Australia, and a lot of them went to the United States as well. But I understand that there are more Letezi people here in Newcastle than there are back in the original village. So their story of migration is one that many immigrants have, you know, over the years, and it's a fabulous story because a lot of these people finally settled in Newcastle after being sponsored here by one of the big Letezi families, the Rosettis, who settled in Proserpine in Queensland. And from there, people like my dad and others who were skilled workers were offered work in places like the BHP, and they have gone on to contribute to the society of Newcastle, and in particular, the suburb of Hamilton.
Can you say the name of that village one more time?
Sure, Letopalena.
I just wanted you to say it again because you say it so beautifully, so romantically. Tell us about the village. Paint a word picture of what that village was like, what went on there, particularly before the war with these families, some of these families who would in time come out here.
It's a uniquely beautiful village, there's only 400 people live there. Those homes were made by their forefathers. For example, my grandfather was a blacksmith, and he used to come up from his little home, which was down by the river, and whenever he'd hear a bell ring, he'd know that somebody wanted their shoe or their mule or their donkey reshoed. The village itself had a beautiful old span bridge that connected one part of the village to the other. There was a single solitary church, which was important to the people there. It was facing the base of a very famous location called the Mayella Mountain. The place is well known for its agriculture. They make fabulous wines. Everybody is self-sufficient. There is one bar in the whole village that supplies people everything. And you really can't be stepping out of line because everybody knows everything about everyone.
How did the village fare during the Second World War?
Oh, well, it was pretty much completely destroyed. There's a story of my uncle, my father's brother, as a young boy trying to salvage what was left in his house as the Germans were retreating. And the people that were looking at this unfolding from up above could see the spray of bullets down by this little fella's feet as he was trying to forage for what he could of his parents' belongings. So it was a tough time, and as the Germans were retreating through Italy and through these little villages, they thought it was necessary to destroy everything. But a sad story, but they have rebuilt it to their credit, and it remains a beautiful village to this day.
As you mentioned, these families left the village to start a new life, but nonetheless, from the stories you heard from your own family, how hard was it to leave the old life?
I think the hardest thing was leaving family and friends. Italians, as most people know, are very passionate and very family-orientated people. So that, I would think, was the hardest thing of all for those people to bear. In the case of my parents, my father was a young man, so there was a sense of excitement in going somewhere different. But ultimately, the saddest thing would have been to leave family and friends and probably knowing they would never return.
Have you, as a descendant, gone to this village? And if you have, what's it been like?
Well, I've been several times, mainly to see the remaining family that were there. I absolutely love it because with all the travelling that I do, seeing big, exciting cities is fabulous. But seeing this small, natural setting is really mind-blowing and very, very special. And to know that that's where my roots are was really special to me.
And Vinny, have you played in that bar there, that solitary bar in the town?
As a matter of fact, I have.
Oh.
And I've got fond memories of it. It got a bit messy after a while, but they wanted to hear me sing and play. I used to sing back in those days, Cat Stevens songs and stuff like that, which I did, gladly, and they loved it. And then after a while, the guys pulled out their mandolins and their piano accordions, and we actually had a wonderful time.
Beyond the connection of the Rossetti family that you mentioned, and you mentioned Proserpine in Queensland, so presumably they were up there for the sugarcane, were they?
Exactly. Very, very hard-working people, and I'm not sure exactly why they ended up in the sugarcane, that Rossetti family. But as a result of that, they had established themselves as hard-working and were in a position to be able to sponsor their other family and friends to come. So you can imagine coming from a small Italian village of 400 people into the heat of Proserpine and then harvesting sugar would have been a real culture shock.
So why, given the Proserpine connection, did so many families, including your own, end up in Newcastle, and more specifically, why end up in Hamilton?
Well, a very good question. Firstly, there's a trust element, and a lot of these people came on assisted voyages, back in the day, and had full trust in the Rossetti family. So that was their first point of entry. The Newcastle connection is an interesting one. At the time, as you can imagine, the BHP Steelworks were a centre for employment here, and there were a lot of skilled workers trying to build a city, and exporting steel and coal was a big deal. So once the Italian gentlemen heard that there was work available for them, a lot of them as labourers, but some as skilled workers. In the case of my father, he was a cabinet maker, so he ended up being a form worker in the BHP. That was the connection to Newcastle. Ultimately, Hamilton, for some reason, had a handful of Italian immigrants here, and it became known as a hub for Italians. They came to know that people were making their own tomato sauces and making pork sausages, and so they wanted to be where the action was. All the Italian delis started to spring up around here, and even famously some of the gambling houses, which is another story. But they would make their own wine, their own food, they would harvest their own fruit and vegetables. So that's the Italian connection. They had spread out a bit, but this was also known, as many people know today, as Little Italy.
And we'll be talking more about that when we wander into the epicentre of so-called Little Italy, into Beaumont Street. But as we stand outside your old family home here in Cleary Street, you mentioned you played with your dad, who played mandolin. You'd picked up a guitar.
Yeah.
What made you pick up a guitar? What was the inspiration or the impulsion to do that?
I believe that on my grandmother's side, my father's mother, I was told only recently that there is a possibility that she comes from a Spanish heritage. I don't know that for a fact, but from the earliest age, the sound of music was something really exciting and very special to me. Even though my father was doing it through his mandolin, I always loved the idea of the guitar, always. And one weekend, as he was reading his Daily Telegraph, the comic section in the middle was something I always got. There was a section there where I could write away and ask for a music book that came from the United States. Anyway, long story short, that book came back with a bunch of songs in there, like Song of the Marines and Home on the Range, and this music that, a little 8-year-old kid would have known nothing about. I totally fell in love with it. I fell in love with the idea and the sound of the guitar. Not long after, my mother took me to Foley's music store in Newcastle, run by Mr. Lindsay, and bought my first guitar. And there began a love affair with this instrument that's never stopped to this day. And it always had to be the guitar, it always was the guitar. And here I am all these years later, still incredibly passionate about it.
Can you remember what went through to your heart when you strummed or plucked that guitar for the first time?
I remember very, very strongly going to one of my first music lessons, and my first teacher, who was a dear friend of my grandfather, who's now passed away, Mr. Felice de Vitas, would sit in the front veranda of his house, and that's where I'd have these lessons, and he would play the saxophone, he would play the piano accordion and a number of instruments, and he would have me accompany him on the guitar, and therefore taught me how to learn rhythm. It was the sound of my first D minor and A minor chords that totally threw me for a loop. I fell in love with that exotic Phrygian type sound of these minor shapes and these chords, and it just transported me immediately into a world that I've stayed having a connection with all these years later.
How old were you at this point when you had this feeling?
That feeling there came, my first lesson was about 8, I was 8 or 9 years old, yeah.
So while most 8 or 9-year-old boys with a guitar in their hands are dreaming of being a rock star, you're thinking of making beautiful, romantic, melancholic music.
Well, I guess I was, I didn't know to what extent, but I totally was drawn into that world, and have really explored it ever since, through the study of classical guitar and Spanish flamenco to a small extent. But that whole concept of those lyrical sounds, I think, draws us into a bigger palette of sounds, across the world. So I like the idea of calling what I do more world music, instead of niching it within a smaller boundary.
Did you ever dream of being a rock star as a kid?
I guess I did, like everybody. I remember once, again as a kid, I had an electric guitar, and I tried to put it behind my head and be a show off and do these like Chuck Berry licks, but you only have to fall over 2 or 3 times to know that's not for you. So I had to move on from there.
Tell us more about this gentleman, Mr. DeVitas. Was he part of the Letezi group?
He was a very important part of the Letezi group. I would say he was one of the founding fathers of this community. The family was well known to this community, a lot of generational people from that family. He had taught a number of fledgling musicians along the way, and all the Italian families, whoever had a child that wanted to study music would take them to Mr. DeVitas. I would go to his house and I'd be greeted by either his wife or his daughter, and I'd sit in the hallway in a solitary chair waiting for my turn, and they would always offer me a coffee or an Italian freshly made cake. So I'd go into my lesson well and truly wired and ready to go.
Mr. DeVitas, was he a full-time music teacher, and what was his background? How did he arrive both here and in music?
DeVitas came to Australia via the United States. He was what you would call a professional musician. He had studied music seriously. His time in the United States allowed him to compose and write manuscript. He had volumes of his own manuscript books filled with all kinds of music, with his own handwritten tablature and music script. It's just an absolute Pandora's box of the most valuable music you could ever get. And a lot of that music was some of the folk music that came from his village in Italy, and his Abruzzo and his Italy. And luckily for me, I was able to learn from his handwritten manuscripts, and I'll never forget that, because those books now, I don't know exactly where they are, to me are a really special piece of history.
How did that connect you with your own identity and your own heritage by virtue of learning that regional music that Mr. DeVitas had painstakingly handwritten and passed on to you?
I think by default, the sound of that music just spoke to me, very deeply. Luckily for me, I fell in love with it. It was something that I truly liked.
You mentioned other local kids went to Mr. DeVitas for lessons. Did any of those come to be well-known musicians?
Absolutely, and I'd like to mention a couple of names here in particular, if I may. A very dear friend of mine, Leo Della Grotta, a very well-known and respected Novocastrian, was taking lessons at around the same time. But Leo, to his credit, was smart enough to learn an instrument with 4 strings rather than 6, and has gone on now to be a wonderful musician, a wonderful human, and again, a person who loves his music.
And a decent bass player.
Yeah, very, very decent bass player. Another guy that maybe is not so well known anymore, but Mr. DeVitas' grandson, Mario D'Andrea, very, very well established guitarist who used to play in the NBN show band, the West Leagues Club backing band, and became an entertainer in his own right. Went to the United States, married a girl from California, and became a highly sought after musician on the US circuit, all with the launching pad of this little house in Hamilton.
Wow. How many people from this group, the Letezi, came to Newcastle, and now how many descendants of the Letezi would be still here?
It's hard to give you an exact number, Scott, but I would say, we're probably, with the descendants, original, people who came, their children, grandchildren, and now perhaps their great-grandchildren, I would say in their thousands. And it speaks to the migration process that is a phenomenon all around the world. These stories are repeated countless times in other countries. So, contributed in different ways. A lot of these people, obviously, their names have changed. They're not all Martinellis and Della Grottas, but I think the ideal and the connection with that original Letezi migration process has truly left a legacy. My father first turned up here in 1958, I believe, and he has never gone back. He sadly recently passed away, but he had a great life in Australia and never felt the need to go anywhere else, and was very proud of what he'd achieved and the family that he'd produced.
And your mum?
My mum came probably 59. She came with her brother and her sister and lived with them until such times that she met my father, and they got married a year later.
Where did they meet? How did they come to meet?
That's a great story. My mother's brother was a barber, and what he used to do was to cut all the local Italian boys' hair on weekends to make some extra cash. And of course, my uncle was sharing his house with his two very attractive young Italian sisters, who also attracted an incredible amount of traffic for haircuts on the weekend. So my father was one of the guys that fell victim to my mother, and they got married shortly afterwards.
What was your dad's name? What's your mum's name?
My dad's name was Nelio Martinelli. My mother's name is Maria Bernadetta Martinelli.
So as we mentioned, it was in this house here that you learnt and practiced your guitar, but it wasn't in Cleary Street you had your debut. Can you take me to where you had your debut?
I would love to, Scott. You know, that is a very, very treasured memory.
Vinny, we're standing in Lawson Street outside a group of retirement homes. Why are we here?
Well, we're here, Scott, because this new building replaced an icon of traditional Letezi and Italian heritage. Back in the day, the building that was here was called the Transport Hall, and it is directly behind the bus depot here in Hamilton. What used to happen here is that I think it started off as once a month, but maybe every 6 months after that, we would have what was called an Italian family dance evening. And the folks, the people would all bring their homemade food and their cakes and their young families and their kids, and they'd all congregate and have a really wonderful night. Most times there would be a band playing. And that band was overseen by none other than Felice De Vitis. And at the time I was his student, and I will never forget the first time I was able to come and perform with him on the stage. I think I was about 11 or 12 years old. I might as well have been Elvis Presley, because there was myself, him on piano accordion, and a drummer, and we made all this music. And when I saw people actually dancing to what we were playing, that's when I did feel like a rock star. You know, it was a fun night. It was wonderful. I had a little, I think 7-8 watt amplifier that I put on a chair, and my first electric guitar, which I still have. And off we went. You know, we launched into all these Italian songs and what we thought was kind of cooler music back then, but that was a wonderful memory. All in the Transport Hall. It would have been 1972.
1972, and how old were you?
I was 12.
12 years old, the centre of attention playing that guitar. How does that shape a boy to the man he became?
Well, it gave me an incredible amount of confidence. You know, there was nothing I thought I couldn't do. Besides loving it so much, you know, it really was important. And I think, you know, you watch a lot of kids today and, you know, watch some of these shows like, you know, Australia's Got Talent and all these things. To give those kids an opportunity to be in such a wonderful environment and do well gives you a confidence that you can't underestimate the value of. And so important. You know, confidence is important for every artist, but I was grateful to have had mine in this way.
It was this musical nursery for you, but it sounds like it was also a social hub for the local Italian community.
It was, you know, back then, you know, the women would get together, all the families were together, the children would congregate and play in a very safe and friendly environment. It was a really amazing, nurturing experience, and it's actually a very cultural experience, because those Italian models of congregating and socializing have almost vanished, you know, sadly. But I do remember being part of a traditional Italian heritage, which remains very important to me.
From here, where did you set off, both in an educational sense with your music and also in your gigs, in your playing?
I went on to seek out some of the better music teachers here in Newcastle, and one that I'd like to mention is a very well-known and respected musician here in Newcastle, Steve Cowley. Another gentleman, Mark Ongley, was a guy that I studied with here in Newcastle at the Novocastrian Music Store. I ended up being a music teacher there myself. I also taught, after studying with Steve, at Foley's Music for a little while. Not long after that, as things were getting better, I auditioned for a place at the Conservatorium of Music in Auckland Street, and got in, and continued studying in Canberra and Sydney School of Music, and was very fortunate to win a graduation prize from the music school in Newcastle. And from there I studied in Italy for a lot of years. And that's when the travels started, and here I am, still trying to get better and still working hard at it.
And releasing music, recording music.
I just released my 5th album. It's an album called Angel, which I dedicated to my 2 sons, Ricardo and Joel, and still very much enjoy performing in front of a crowd, which I've missed in the last couple of years.
Do you ever have pinch yourself moments where you've been on a stage or on a luxurious cruise ship performing where you think, wow, how did a Hamilton boy who played at the Transport Hall end up here?
Almost every single time. The things that I think about before I go on stage in that kind of environment where there's a larger crowd or people are actually have paid to come and see me perform, I will always, almost as a ritual, acknowledge where I've come from. I think about my family, I think about my father, and those thoughts carry me through the show. I will always think to myself, I'm going to do as well as I can for them, and that has helped me to this day.
Shall we wander around to Beaumont Street and talk a little about what used to be there and how it compares to now?
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Well, Vinny, here we are in the hum and the buzz of Beaumont Street, and at the next table is a group of Italian gentlemen who seem to remember you and seem to be delighted to see you. It was like a star was in their presence.
Yeah, great guys. You know, that's pretty much the sentiment of the Italian community here in a nutshell. You know, they are very supportive of their own. And we're also sitting here, Scott, like right next door to a very famous delicatessen that used to serve the Italian community here through 2 or 3 different owners. This was a place that I remember going back as young as 10, 12 years old. My mother would send me down here to buy liqueur kits, and I would take them home, and she would make things like a Strega liqueur and different flavoured liqueurs, and of course I'd get to sample them.
At 12 years of age?
Absolutely. You know, you're allowed to have a little bit when you're 12. Now, I also I had wine with water with my meal, and as a result, I had a very healthy respect for alcohol growing up and never needed to experiment with it.
Well, you mentioned there was a delicatessen next door. What was that one called?
Well, it was called, back then, it was Tony's Delicatessen, because it was run by Tony Dacioni and his wife, Pina, who used to do an incredible trade. The small goods that they used to supply, the salamis and the mortatellas and the cheeses, a lot of this stuff was fully imported, or they'd make their own pork sausages and olives and sweets and breads. You know, well, the best of the best came out of this delicatessen.
They were from the Letezi community?
Yeah, Tony Dacioni is a prominent member of the Letezi community, as is his family.
And as we sit here having a coffee, and I just realise I'm probably insulting Italian heritage by having a chai latte. Apologies for that. Sorry, Vinny. We're at the overtime. What did this used to be? Was this a hub of Italian-Australian social discourse as it is at the next table with those gents talking?
It's funny that the Italians still migrate here, congregate here. There's obviously a feeling amongst them where they feel comfortable and welcome. Prior to this, it was owned by Leo Della Grotta and his wife Janet, and they did a roaring trade. I recall Leo telling us just recently that people would come here before hours, and Leo was compelled to come to the balcony. They lived upstairs and take people's orders while he was still just getting up out of bed. But this is the kind of place we have. But it's always been a draw. I mean, geographically, where it's situated in Newcastle, right next to the deli, opposite Nina's IGA, the famous Capana restaurant, which is on the corner here of Tudor and Cleary Street. You know, obviously a very central hub in the Italian community. Just further down the road was the very famous and well-attended Scalabrini Centre, which had attached to it a chapel, a Catholic chapel, and also a place where Italians in general, not just the Letezis, would celebrate family dances. Very, very popular place back in the day.
So how prominent back in the day was the presence of Italy, of the Italians, and more specifically of the Letezi community along Beaumont Street?
Very, very significant. I mean, women would shop here every day. Men would congregate after work, for example, at the Kent Hotel for a beer before they went home. That often happened at the Exchange Hotel down the other end there in Denison Street. The kids who would be coming home from school or on their way to their park to play. It was a very, very strong Italian presence here. Having said that, obviously in parallel were the Macedonian and Greek communities who were also very strong in the time. So Hamilton back then, even though it was regarded as a Little Italy, was a very strong and legitimate cultural base in Newcastle. It's dissipating a little bit now as the generations, watered down that feeling of ethnicity over the years. This place really had a feel for another culture, and it was moving hand in hand with the present Anglo-Saxon feel that it had here, but it was a really exciting place to be in. You could smell the different smells, the people looked a little bit different, but it was exciting.
How much was it also an education for the broader Newcastle community? And I say that with some degree of knowledge as a boy growing up in Newcastle. This was the beginning of my education of European food, European languages, of an otherness that was both attractive and to a young Novocastrian seemed exotic. So how much was my experience, do you think, the broader Novocastrian experience, where here along Beaumont Street we learned of a bigger, wider, richer world?
Yes, what you saw in the Italian community here and observed is something that, we would have taken a lot of pride in. For example, food to an Italian is very important. And the fact that we're able to share it and have it appreciated by people like yourself and other Australians is wonderful, because it's probably one of the most important things in life. I have a great story of when I was in high school. I was lucky enough to go to a very good school, Morris Brothers in Hamilton, and I remember going to school with some guys who came from, very well-to-do backgrounds, and one of the guys whose parents encouraged him to go and visit Vincenzo Martinelli's house and have a look at what the culture was like inside this Italian family. I invited him along, and my mother greeted him at the door with an Italian welcome and a coffee and a glass of wine, and shared in her cooking experience on the day, and he was literally blown away, and took that story back home with him and shared it amongst hundreds of people, and I'm hoping that this is the kind of thing that we were able to share in a positive way with our Aussie friends, and something that has allowed us to become the successful assimilated group that we have, and take a lot of pride in being here as a result of all of that came before us.
When you look up and down Beaumont Street now, how much has it changed, and how do you feel about that change?
The first thing that comes to mind is a little bit of sadness, because there was a kind of excitement in that cultural wealth that we had here that's kind of gone, To openly see these Italians gesticulating with their hands and actually speaking other languages in public was kind of exciting. Even though I was born in Australia and consider myself Australian, that cultural aspect and those traditions have kind of gone, so that's sad. Walking up and down the street, you obviously see the older generation of people still enjoying being out and socialising, but the delis are kind of gone, those famous restaurants are kind of gone. The new generation of children, grandchildren, they've become ossified.
You still know people. As you're talking to me, you're waving to people in a car passing by.
A good friend of mine who I grew up down the street.
Can you imagine what Newcastle would be like without the contribution of the Italian community, without the Letezi community here?
Well, I would imagine it wouldn't be the same place. I want to believe that we have contributed in a really good, positive way. We have made friends of our new community, and vice versa. I think the contribution of something a little bit quirky in the sense of cultural norms, bringing the best of what we have to offer and sharing it with the people of our new community has hopefully made it a richer society to live in. We're talking about all kinds of things, may it be the tailors that we have in our community, the musicians, the lawyers, the business people, the social ways that we have of family and the way we treat our friends. We hope that that's all contributed to make it, a more exotic, for want of a better word, and interesting place to live.
And for the Letezi community and the descendants of the original Letezi folk, how has Newcastle helped make them? How has it helped enrich the community? How has it enriched you?
I can say from the outset that one of the things that all the Letezi that I know will say right off the bat is that they are supremely grateful for this amazing country that they've come to live in. Its natural beauty, the friendliness of the people that have accepted them into their society, the willingness to grow, and not just grow but actually thrive, which more than likely would not have happened in the war-torn country they came from. They were literally given an incredible second chance at life. They took it, they ran with it, and they're grateful for it.
Finally, you've seen so much of the world, you've played around the world as a master guitarist. How much do you still carry Hamilton in your heart and soul?
I wouldn't be the Vince Martinelli without the Hamilton. I absolutely love this place. It was a privilege to grow up here. All my friends that I still have are from here. My parents raised me here. I went to schools here. I was educated here. I had my first wonderful teacher here. I had my first girlfriend here. So many firsts here. Hamilton will always be a big part of my heart, helped shape me as the person I am today. I talk about it when I'm overseas. I'm super proud of it, and I call it home.
Still?
I still call it home. I love traveling, as you know, but this is where my family live. My mother is still alive and lives here. I have so many memories here, and I will always consider it a very, very special part of my life, and continue to do that.
Vincenzo Martinelli, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your music and bringing to life for me the Hamilton that I knew as a kid. Thanks so much.
A pleasure, Scott. Please come along and listen to some music if you get a chance.
Vincenzo Martinelli playing El Condor Pasa from his latest album titled Angel. And we heard a couple of other tracks from the album, Pachelbel's Canon, and one of Vinny's own compositions, Matador. And you can see Vincenzo playing live in Newcastle while he's here, including a concert at the Gallipoli Legion Club in Hamilton on December the 9th. Well, to find out more about his music, head to his website, vincenzomartinelli.com. And that is it for this episode of the Newcastle Herald's Voices of the Hunter. Thank you for your company and for lending us your ears. I'm Scott Bevan. Until next time, take care.